Good morning, beloveds of God. Those of you here, those of you online. Today's gospel lesson initially seems like Jesus is giving his take on banquet etiquette. Sit here, don't sit there. I know maybe you have also. I've had moments where I've gone into a large hall for some kind of fundraiser meal, lunch or dinner, without assigned seating, and maybe I don't know anybody. I have no idea where to sit. So maybe some good advice. But we can assume that this wasn't really Jesus' agenda. Jesus had come to the home of a leader of the Pharisees to share a meal on the Sabbath. And the guests were watching Jesus as he came in to see what would he do? Where would he sit? But Jesus was watching them too, noticing how guests chose the places of honor. He saw how the guests' desire for power and prestige did not coincide with God's desires. And so, as was Jesus' custom, when he wanted to teach about God's coming kingdom, he told the guests a parable. It was one of many parables Jesus told about banquets, meals with abundant food and drink, usually hosted by a person with some degree of wealth and power. And most of these feasts in the parables were wedding banquets. And Jesus told such stories often in order to illustrate the nature of God's coming reign, which in Luke's gospel, as we have been hearing this year, involves a reversal of the established order of power and privilege in society. But before we get to the social theological dimensions of this parable, let's dwell for a moment with that mental image of a feast. We're in the midst of harvest season here in the Pacific Northwest, aren't we? Corn, tomatoes, blackberries, peaches, salmon. I'm just making myself hungry thinking of it. And as we feast on seasonal delights, it's a good time to reflect on God's abundant blessing. And also, Labor Day is a week from tomorrow, and especially with our gospel text for today, we have an opportunity to honor the work that people do so that we may feast, and also to lift up our Christian vocation of striving for justice for all those who labor. The parable from Luke 14 invites us to consider a couple things. And both are relevant, I think, to reflecting on the church's relationship to labor issues. First, Jesus cautions people against claiming their place at the table based on their own perception of their status. In other words, if you happen to be, say, the senior vice president of sales in a corporation, you might assume if your CEO is throwing a banquet that you would get to sit next to that person, to him or her. But Jesus would, in this parable, invite you to take the lowest place, the place furthest away from the host. And this is not just a matter of banquet etiquette, but is Jesus' way of teaching his followers that our human ways of measuring status, of establishing the proper pecking order, are not God's ways. And it's up to the host, not the guests, to assign the seats. Who knows? At the great banquet, God may want to sit next to someone living in a tent on I-5 as compared to our mayor or our bishop. The second thing that I want to call our attention to is that Jesus addresses the question of who is invited to the table to begin with. Instead of inviting those of us, those who we would expect could repay us with other invitations or favors, invite the poor and the outcast, he says, because they can't repay you. As in other banquet parables, Jesus paints a picture of the coming kingdom of God that is not only inclusive, but which, as I've said, turns upside down the existing social order. Jesus had announced his mission in Luke 4 when he said he came to bring good news to the poor and liberation to the oppressed. The last shall be first, the first last. Yet, even so, the banquet table remains, and there will be enough for everybody, but not too much. Enough for everybody, but not too much. The kingdom parables of Jesus point those who hear them toward the coming reign of God's justice. This is not just an otherworldly pie in the sky when you die promise. Rather, these parables call Jesus' followers then and now towards God's worldly mission of, on the one hand, transforming the social relationships that keep people locked in poverty and keep people excluded from the table. And on the other hand, extending a gracious hospitality and welcome to the stranger. Both of those. And this theme of hospitality was why we had that second reading from Hebrews. It had a whole lot of different things in it. But at the beginning, we heard, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some have entertained angels without knowing it, referring to Abraham and Sarah. So I want to say a little bit this morning about the importance of the labor movement in advancing justice for those who are marginalized at the table for one reason or another. They may be marginalized because of their position in society, because they're the cooks and the servers, or because they aren't even allowed in the door. In my experience as a pastor elsewhere, not here, the labor movement doesn't get a lot of airtime in church, even in progressive congregations. But the labor movement, especially in recent decades, with the organizing with low-wage workers in hospitality, service, and agricultural sectors, has been so important in advancing an agenda of equity and inclusion. And that organizing parallels much of what progressive faith-based groups are working for a society where everyone has a place at the table. I've been in a little bit of email communication this past week with Eunice Howe, and if there are people here that don't know Eunice, I think those of you who are members here certainly know her. She is an organizer for Unite Here, a union that organizes in the hospitality industry, especially with low-wage workers. She's in, as we prayed for her last week, she is in Reno through the November elections, helping work for candidates that support a pro-labor agenda. Eunice shared with me via email a reflection that she offered at worship last summer, Sunday worship. And in that reflection, she talked about her own journey that started when she was an 11-year-old Lutheran youth in Illinois. And she went to one of those 30-hour hunger famines, and she came away with deep questions. I just love imagining, like, the 11-year-old with those questions. Pastor, why are people hungry? And she, her journey, she went on quite a journey, but her journey led her, in her own words, to work in the labor movement, not just to relieve hunger for one day, but to support workers organizing for better wages so laborers could afford to feed their families and provide a better life. And she clearly, in her reflection, understood this as a calling from God, in her words, to live out my faith in a concrete way. So Eunice is part of a long line of people of faith who have worked closely with the labor movement. We can think of famous ones like, theologian Reinhold Niebuhr in Detroit, Catholic activist Dorothy Day, many others. our multi-faith statewide advocacy organization, Faith Action Network, that this congregation is part of and supports, has partnered with some of the unions, including Unite Here, to advocate for better wages and working conditions for some of our lowest wage workers. And some years ago, these efforts led to unionization at the Westin. I remember involvement of Paul Benz in that. And now most recently, actually at the Edgewater Hotel, and even more recently at Lumen Field. And it's my understanding from Eunice that your Pastor Sue offered support and a blessing to the workers that were involved in the Edgewater Hotel campaign. Going back further, some of you may remember the church's support for farm workers through the United Farm Workers, UFW, led by Cesar Chavez then and Dolores Huerta. In the 1960s, when I was a participant in Lutheran campus ministry, when it was down in that house down the street here, I learned about the great boycott from Jean Raywinkle, longtime member of this congregation, who served on campus ministry staff. The fact that I remember that, well, you remember things like that. And the strategy, of course, was to bring financial pressure on the growers by not buying grapes, so they would negotiate with the UFW. And it was a long and difficult struggle, but at least that phase of the organizing, it was ultimately successful. And lots of faith-based folks were involved in that. While labor issues and the struggle for workers' rights may not get much airtime in churches today, many theologians and ethicists have long understood that supporting fairness for workers is integral to our faith-based work of loving our neighbor and transforming our society in the direction of the justice God desires for all creation. And Lutherans have a history in this regard. Martin Luther, in his explanation of the seventh commandment, thou shalt not steal, included within the definition of stealing, overcharging the poor and underpaying laborers. Actually, Luther had a lot to say about economics that hasn't gotten a lot of play in the church. And the ELCA's social statement, sufficient, sustainable livelihood for all, that says a lot right there. Sufficient, sustainable livelihood for all, committed the church to certain standards for its own employees. That was controversial in terms of wages, and also supported workers' rights to organize, and called for policies and practices in the government and corporate arenas to support a living wage, health care, and basic worker rights. Justice for workers, especially those with the lowest pay and the least protection, is central to our calling from God to be part of the work of transforming society toward the vision of God's shalom, toward God's reign of justice and mercy. But I want to come back again to Luke's gospel and that image of the banquet in Jesus' parable. Because that is where we encounter not just our calling to work for justice, but the enormous blessing of God that empowers our work. Our hymns this morning really pick up that theme of the table, the feast, the people who are all invited, and who all have a place. And I have a mental picture of a feast, and it's a potluck. We bring bounty from our gardens and farmers markets and the sea, and of course, Washington State wines from the grapes, and we serve each other. There aren't any waiters working for low wages who are bringing our plates. Many of us have a part in the preparation. Everyone, the upstairs folk and the downstairs folks, are there. No one has assigned seats. And we sit with someone to get to know them better, not to advance any kind of agenda that will serve our own needs. There's plenty of food, but not too much. And there is joy and deep thanksgiving for one another and for the invisible but ever-present host who has invited us. We may have brief, beautiful experiences of such a meal. I know I have. And those experiences can sustain us for the work of advocacy for those who in this everyday world, short of the coming kingdom, they do serve us in our daily lives, at hotels, at restaurants, stores, countless other jobs. So in a few minutes, let us go, figuratively at least, to the banquet, as we will sing, to go to the banquet, to the feast of the universe. The table set and a place is waiting, everyone with some gifts to share. That weekly communion feast that we share gives us a glimpse of what God desires for us all. Enough, but not too much. Radical equality, a place for everyone. And it unites us and feeds us for the work ahead to move toward that vision. As we share Holy Communion, let us give thanks for the overflowing blessing of God and the table God has set where all are welcome. Amen.